This is the story of Jennie Harris. She was my great-great-grandmother on my father's side. Jennie's ancestors can be traced back to the 1600s. In 1676, Jurien Hartsfelder migrated from Germany to Pennsylvania. Germantown was a popular German settlement in Philadelphia during the late 1600s. Jurien Hartsfeld and Margaret Pauling had a son named Adam who changed his last name to Hatfield. There were 5 generations of Hatfields who lived in Pennsylvania. In 1807, Barbara Hatfield met Leonard Kelly. They moved from Germantown, Pennsylvania to Knox, Ohio, and had a son named James Kelly. James Kelly and Caroline Lockwood had a daughter named Lucia. Lucia Kelly and Lorenzo Brailsford had a daughter named Luella. Luella Brailsford moved from Bycross, Ohio to Mitchell, Kansas. In 1890, Luella Brailsford married Jonathan Hodgson. On November 4th, 1893, Jennie Myrtle Hodgson was born in Harrington, Kansas. Jennie was the second of 6 children. She had 4 brothers, John Arley, George, Joseph, and Robert, and a sister, Ethel. Not much is known about Jennie's early life. Her father, Jonathan, grew up in Ontario, Canada, before moving to Kansas. Jennie, who was half Canadian, grew up in Harrington, Kansas. When Jennie was 6, she saw the dawn of the 20th century. On July 20th, 1894, Elwyn Jonathan Hughes was born in Waverly, Kansas. He was the oldest of 5 children. Elwyn's parents, Ernest Hughes and Mary Conklin, were both from Iowa. In 1910, Elwyn moved to Harrington, Kansas, where he met Jennie Hodgson. On November 20th, 1914, Jennie Hodgson married Elwyn Hughes. A year later, Jennie's first daughter, Myrtle Evelyn Hughes, was born. Myrtle was Jennie's middle name. In 1917, Elwyn registered for the Whirlwind Draft, but didn't go because he had epilepsy. That same year, Jennie's second daughter, Lorraine Bell Hughes, was born. In 1918, Jennie had a third daughter, Elma Roberta Hughes, also known as Dolly. In 1920, Jennie's fourth daughter, Gertrude Lucille Hughes, was born, but I always called her Trudy. After Trudy was born, Elwyn and Jennie moved to Highland, Kansas. For a while, it was just Jennie and her 4 daughters. The sisters were close in age and grew up together. Lorraine, Dolly, and Trudy were part of a singing group called the Hughes Trio. While in Highland, Kansas, something happened which caused Jennie and Elwyn to break up. After the breakup, Jennie started seeing Frank Harris, who was Elwyn's cousin. Frank was also the best man at Jennie and Elwyn's wedding. Let's explore this connection. Robert Harris and Maggie May Likes had 3 children. Then Robert dies young, age 34, and Maggie marries Bert Conklin and has 7 children. Bert has 5 siblings, one of whom is Mary Conklin. Mary Conklin marries Ernest Hughes, and their son is Elwyn Hughes. So Frank is Bert's stepson, which means that Frank and Elwyn are step cousins. Jennie and Frank reunited, fell in love, and they got married on June 14, 1923. William Franklin Harris was born on October 9, 1896, in Waverly, Kansas. Frank's father, Robert Thomas Harris, was from Kentucky, while Frank's mother, Maggie May Likes, was from Illinois. Robert and Maggie moved to Kansas, where they met each other. They got married in Burlington on February 17, 1896, and had 3 children. Frank registered for the draft in 1919 when he was 22 years old. He also worked at a lumber company for many years.
He worked for many, many years for a company called Hawley Lumber Company. And he would do just about everything, in a lumber yard.
Oh, interesting.
Sometimes he would come home black because he would handle coal.
2 years after getting married, Jennie and Frank had a daughter. Clarabelle Ethel Harris was born in 1925. She didn't care for Clarabelle, so she went by Clara. In 1928, Jennie had her first son, William Robert Harris. William was named after his father. but everyone called him Billy. In 1930, Marvin Bruce Harris was born, just in time for the 1930 United States Census. If you zoom in on the census, you can see everyone's name. In 1931, Jennie's third son, Joseph Daniel Harris, was born. Joe helped me a lot with this project. That same year, Ellen Hughes passed away. He was 36 years old and left behind 4 daughters. And in 1934, Jennie's ninth and final child, Dolores May Harris, was born. Thus, the 9 children of Jennie Harris were all here. She had enough children to start a Kansas baseball team.
I'll give it to you.
So where does this family fall in terms of historical context?
During World War I, the demand for wheat to support Allied troops encouraged farmers to plow under the grasslands and plant huge wheat crops. After years of excellent crops, livestock was finally allowed back to graze. Their hooves pulverized the unprotected soils. This, along with several dry years with little rain, turned the soil to dust. In 1934, strong winds blew the soil into huge clouds of dust that blocked the sun for days, smothered crops, destroyed pasture lands, and in some places could bury a barn in 3 to 6 feet of dust.
Kansas is part of the Southern Plains. In the 1920s, the American economy was booming. People would travel to the Southern Plains, buy land, and become farmers. Wheat farmers did very well. Then the bubble burst. The stock market crash of 1929 affected everyone. Then large dust storms swept the land. In 1933 alone, there were 38 dust storms in the Southern Plains. These are the conditions the Harris family grew up in. So how did the Harris family get out of Dodge? When Lorraine Hughes was 17, she met a man named Luther Flores, who lived across the street in Harrington. He was 23 at the time. Lutherio Angel Flores was born on October 2nd, 1910, in Zacatecas, Mexico. As a child, Luther migrated to Texas and then to Kansas. As a young adult, Luther worked on the railroad. Luther and Lorraine met as neighbors, which is how you met people in those days. Interracial relationships faced discrimination in the Midwest. In 1937, Lorraine and Luther decided to leave Kansas and move to California. They hopped on a bus and headed west. Lorraine's sister Trudy made the trip with them and acted as a buffer between Lorraine and Luther so that they wouldn't be viewed as a married couple. Luther, Lorraine, and Trudy moved to Los Angeles, where Luther had a cousin. Luther quickly got a job at a tire-making company. Lorraine and Luther got married on March 10, 1938, in Los Angeles. 4 months later, their first child, Jerry Flores, was born on July 26. During this time, Trudy was also looking for love. Legend has it that Trudy went on a date, got stood up, and met Alfred Reyes Garcia, who also got stood up on a date. Alfred was born in Chihuahua, Mexico, on September 9, 1915. He migrated to El Paso and then to Los Angeles as a young man. Trudy and Alfred began a relationship and got married on March 9, 1938, the day before Lorraine and Luther got married. 6 months later, Alfred and Trudy had their first child, James Alfred Garcia, on September 13th. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be here today. While Lorraine and Trudy were young brides in the City of Angels, Jennie was back in Kansas with a doting husband and 7 children. It wasn't long before the rest of the gang wanted to move west too. Dolly stayed behind. She had recently gotten married to Siegel Hodgson and had 2 boys, Thurn and Levon. Like a young Clark Kent leaving Smallville, Kansas for the big city metropolis, Jennie, Frank, and 6 children packed up the family car and drove over the rainbow.
Ain't you gonna look back, Ma? Give the old place a last look?
We're going to California, ain't we? All right then, let's go to California.
Jennie moved to the Lincoln Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles in 1940. I am at 421 Avenue 20 in Lincoln Heights, and this is the house that Jennie Harris lived in for 30 years.
She was always on that street, and Jim and I were latchkey kids. My parents both worked, especially during the war, before my dad went into the service in 45 when he was drafted. But the onus of that whole neighborhood was Grandma's house. And when Jim and I would walk home from school, which was only a block and a half, and the main street we crossed had a little tunnel to go under the street, we didn't have to worry about traffic, and there wasn't that much traffic in those days. But we'd stop by in the morning. We were all pretty poor, and every time we would go to Grandma's house, which I loved to do, she always made these incredible biscuits. They were about this high, and they were squares. But they just rip it on this big loaf. She always had a hot bread, not always hot, but bread and oleo, not butter. No one could afford butter.
Dolly wasn't far behind. While Yvonne was still a baby, Siegel went to jail for a bar fight. This drama prompted Dolly to leave Siegel and join her family in the Golden State.
I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
Named in 1917, Lincoln Heights is an old Los Angeles neighborhood that overlooks the LA River. The city is known for its Victorian mansions, which have been historically preserved. But as wealthy residents departed in the 1920s, the city saw an increase in Italian, Irish, and French immigration. In the 1930s, the area saw an increase of Dust Bowl Okies who migrated from the Great Plains to seek greater opportunity. It must have been quite a culture shock to go from a farm in Kansas to a concrete jungle like Lincoln Heights. Ladies and gentlemen, Lincoln Park.
Lincoln Heights was a great little blue-collar town at the time in the 40s. And all the neighbors knew who everybody was. And if we were past our bounds, we heard about it when we got back, including Grandma would report that I wasn't in school or whatever. I was there too early or whatever, but just gently.
So the year is 1940. Jennie and Frank are living with 6 children in Lincoln Heights. Myrtle and Dolly were already adults. Clara finished her education at Lincoln High School. Marvin, Billy, Joe, and Dee went to Florence Nightingale Middle School and then transferred to Lincoln High School. I am here at the famous Lincoln High School in Lincoln Heights, Los Angeles. A bunch of Jennie's children went here. We have Clara, Marvin, Billy, Joe, and Dee all went to this high school, and a number of Jennie's grandchildren went to this high school as well, the famous Lincoln High School. Abraham Lincoln High School was named after the 16th president. It began as a grammar school in 1878 and became one of the first public high schools in California. In the 1940s, the school was expanded and updated thanks to FDR's Works Progress Administration. Trudy and Alfred moved to the nearby town of El Sereno with their 2 sons, Jimmy and Ronnie. In 1945, Alfred joined the Army as a mess sergeant. When Alfred returned home, he and Trudy had 2 more sons, Michael and Mark. Mark also went to Lincoln High School, where he played football. Jennie's greatest legacy was her faith. Her and Frank attended the Salvation Army Church in Lincoln Heights for years.
But it's my grandmother's love, Jennie's love for the Salvation Army, that I still today give the Salvation Army. I'm sure there's controversy of what they do and don't do, but as far as I was concerned as a kid, that they treated me with love and grace and gave us toys at Christmas, let us be in plays, Christmas plays, what we did at the Salvation Army. And that's how, anytime I think of my grandmother, I think of the Salvation Army. That's where her heart was.
Jennie always made an effort to share her faith with her children and grandchildren.
And she was really the first exposure I had as a Christian. Something was very different about her than other elderly people that I knew. There's so much love in her face and her voice. And I used to love to go visit her with my parents. And it seemed like every time that we visited her, she would always ask me this one question. But I first have to tell you that I'm about 7 or 8 years old. And she's 4 feet 5 inches tall. So the first thing she would do is come up and welcome me in her home. But then she would come up right to my face, eye to eye. And she would very tenderly say, "Do you know my Jesus?" And of course at that time, I'm not even sure what I remember what I'm saying, but it didn't matter because I could just hear the love of the question in her heart. And she was so sincere, and that's probably the most memorable thing I remember about Jennie. And of course, now I'm a Christian.
Jennie was all about spending quality time with family, and because of her example, the family was always very close.
We had a loving family. We have a family that cared for each other, and of course we would have our scrapes and stuff like that, but we had a family that was just bonded together and loved each other and took care of each other. And of course my mom, she wouldn't have it any other way.
Right, yeah.
Because my mom, she was the glue that we all abode by. And she would kind of sit back and just let everybody else be in the forefront. Mm-hmm. And she would just beam with pride, that these are mine.
Jennie loved gospel music and hymns. Whenever the family would gather, they would play instruments and sing together.
Her whole family, all her sons and daughters, and her husband, my grandfather, all I can remember is they're singing gospel songs. And all of them played guitars. Or in ranch style, they're called guitars. But they sang duets and harmony. And all these are my uncles and aunts. And my grandfather, he played a harmonica along with them. And it was a very unusual harmonica because it had like 5 different keys of harmonicas all on a rotary type instrument. So all he had to do is just turn it around to play something in a different key. But they were all playing gospel music all the time.
We used to always, when they get together, and get out the instruments, and all the brothers and sisters was there, some relation with all the family time. Let's sing Mom's song, and that was Take Up Thy Cross.
Oh,
I don't know if you've
the great hymn.
Heard that particular one, but good song.
Jennie was also known for her baking skills. She would make homemade bread and biscuits. She would bake a pie and let it cool in the windowsill, like a Norman Rockwell painting.
For birthdays, including mine and my dad's and my mom's, she would always bake their favorite pie, because she was a great pie maker. The type of crust that would melt in your mouth. It was never hard, just melt. But she was generous that way. She would always make a pie for someone else.
Yeah, I mean, she made, the crust around the edge was light and it just melted in your mouth. I don't know how she did. I don't know how she got the money to make those pies. I think they just starved themselves. And she had a big family to feed and a lot of grandchildren. You know?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and then it got to be great grandchildren. More pies. I think she stopped. I think once I left the house, my pies stopped. You know, yeah. I think when you leave the house, your pies stop.
Yeah.
So never leave your house with grandma.
Right. Jennie raised a wonderful family. Myrtle overcame many hardships and was just the sweetest lady you'd ever meet. Lorraine was a tent revival singer who played guitar and dominated the bowling alley. Trudy was a singer and bowler who traveled to Israel and loved to square dance. Dolly was an award-winning poet, a skilled sewer, and a beloved school librarian. Clara was a pistol, a supportive honky-tonk angel, and a skilled piano player. Billy was an ambidextrous guitar player and a Marine who loved a good joke. Marvin was a gifted mechanic who served in Korea and loved cruising around in his Pontiac. Joe was an outfielder in baseball and a talented musician who lived in Lake Havasu for many years. Dee had a tremendous heart for children and worked at a fire tower in Sedona, Arizona. Jennie had 9 children, 15 grandchildren, and 30 great-grandchildren. What a marvelous legacy to have.
It was a comfort place, is what I remember. And when I'd stop by or we'd go over there and stuff, she was always this warm, gentle face that to me glowed. She had the sweetest smiles. It was not big. It was just almost a grin, but her eyes were amazingly loving.
On December 7th, 1969, Jennie Harris passed away at the age of 76. She was buried at Rose Hills Memorial Park in Whittier, California.
Well, my darling, all the lilies are brown and the sky is gray. Oh, I went for a walk, listen on a cold winter's day. I'd be safe and warm, yeah, if I wasn't made, if I was in LA.
1969 was a significant year in American history. Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Rock and roll fans went to Woodstock. Members of the Manson family were arrested. The Beatles recorded their final album. Scooby-Doo premiered on CBS. And Richard Nixon became President of the United States. It was a turning point for the country and marked the end of an era. And it was an era the Harris tribe had to face without a matriarch. Frank Harris lived for another 30 years. Frank was a family man who kept the family traditions going. And Frank was a man of faith who taught in the church for many years.
But one of the things I remember about my granddad was that at 80 years old, he was still teaching Sunday school to adults. And at that time, for some reason, I was really impressed with that at that age he was still teaching. So somehow I had it in my mind that however I was going to serve the Lord, that I would hope that I would serve him as long as he did. and you know, it turned out that way. I taught Sunday school to 3rd and 4th graders for about 50 years, and I was 80 years old about the time that I stopped.
Frank continued to live in the Lincoln Heights house for the rest of his life. Fortunately, he had lots of family around to visit and spend time with. On June 4th, 1986, Frank Harris passed away at the age of 90. He was buried at Rose Hills Memorial Park next to Jennie. I was lucky enough to meet some of Jennie's children, and they were all wonderful. The one I remember the most was Trudy. I used to visit her in Camarillo, and I remember she was fond of coffee, puzzles, and river dance. Out of the 9 siblings, only Joe Harris remains. I met with him about this project, and he was nice enough to let me interview him. Jennie left a rich legacy of love and faithfulness, music and laughter, and she won't be forgotten.
She was a very special grandma. I never saw her mad. I would never see her angry. Mm-hmm. She always would show love. She didn't even have to tell you that she followed Jesus or believed in Jesus. She just showed it, and it just exuberated from her. So she was definitely, those are some good memories from her.
Like lemon drops high above the chimney top, that's where